What I'm going to talk about tonight is bosses, the economics of bosses and management. And, you know, I can't have escaped your notice that managers and bosses are not very popular. I think if you took a straw poll of people out there, you'd have to go in front of St. Paul's Cathedral or to Zloty Park in New York City, where people would say, what should we do with managers? Well, the best thing would be to, shoot half of them. So, I think managers are unpopular, but here's some examples of various managers. I mean, those of you who've seen this movie, Horrible Bosses, will know it's all about how terrible bosses are. And here's two great managers from the retail paper sector in the office in the US and the UK. Managers are the butt of jokes and are very unpopular. But I'm going to try and argue in this lecture, I think that management more generally, not just managers themselves, but management practices, are actually very important for understanding the way that economic life functions. And actually, managers can play a very positive role in improving productivity and improving the well-being and welfare of nations. So that's going to be a journey that we go on tonight, and it's going to take us some strange places. So I'm going to, part of my research over the last few years has been actually doing the radical thing for an economist of talking to people, plant managers in several different places. So here's an example of one place, kind of Nokia factory floor, looks quite a nice place, well organized to work. We've been doing some work in Eastern Europe. This is an example of a state-owned telecoms firm in Belarus. Very interesting capital equipment from the 1950s, it looks like, and no workers, so a very high capital labor ratio. They seem to be on a mysterious break. And also, we've been doing a lot of work, and I'm going to talk about this, of experiments, some randomized control trials, the kind of drug trial equivalent of management practices in some textile factories outside Mumbai. And I'm going to talk about why that seems to suggest that management actually really matters in terms of improving things in India. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to start off by kind of motivating this by talking about productivity. It's a classical economist thing to talk about. Then talk a bit about where the UK stands in terms of productivity. Then go on to say, well, why? I'm going to show you that the UK does pretty badly. That in fact there is a serious lack of productivity in the UK compared to many of our competitors. And I'm going to try and understand why that is. And I'm going to argue that one of the reasons that we might have low productivity is to do with management. And then finally, I'm going to get on to the policy question, which is, well, what can we do to improve things, both in the kind of short run and also in the longer run? And this is very relevant. This month, the Chancellor in his autumn statement is going to announce a growth strategy. So this is exactly, I think, what the Chancellor should be thinking of in his growth strategy. Okay, so what is productivity, and why should we care about it? Well, Paul Krugman, I think, kind of got the nail on the head when he said productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And the reason that Paul said that was for two reasons, really. I mean, in the long run, productivity actually drives the growth of real wages. If you look at people's real wages, the compensation over the last 40 years has basically risen at the same rate as productivity has in the UK and in most other countries in the world. And secondly, it actually can also facilitate redistribution. It's very difficult to redistribute or reduce inequality in the context of a static or shrinking economy. If you can actually get more productivity, you increase the size of the pie, and this creates the opportunity to actually do more redistribution and increase public goods. It's not necessarily going to do that, it's a political choice, but it's much easier to do that in the context of a growing economy than a shrinking economy. And it's particularly important right now in this current era of austerity and cutbacks. So if we want to somehow improve the outputs we get from public services during a time of retrenchment, then one way to do that is try to increase efficiency and productivity. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about austerity. As many of you know, I'm very critical of the government's current austerity plans. But I think no matter who is in power over the next few years in terms of reducing the deficit or debt rates, we need to think about how we can improve efficiency, and that means productivity needs to increase. So what is productivity? Economists, when we try and have a basic welfare measure, we focus on GDP per capita, per head of population. That's not the only thing. There's many other things. Happiness matters, and the environment matters. But I still think material well-being matters. So a basic measure of that is GDP, or national income per person. And you can divide that into 3 components. One component is productivity, GDP per hour, which in the long run, as I said, is the most important part. But there's 2 other parts. One is hours per worker, kind of how hard people work. That's not a, if you increased GDP per person just by making people work longer hours, that would not be a good welfare improvement, I think. A lot of that is choice and labour supply. And then the 3rd component is workers over population, the employment rate. Unemployment will affect that. That's also very important, and certainly a good economy is one which can have a high employment rate. I'm not going to talk so much about that this evening, not because it's not important, just because we haven't really got time to go into it. I want to emphasize that it's growth per capita which matters for welfare. People often talk about growth in general. Growth in general is not, is not from a kind of economic point of view necessarily a good thing. I mean, you can make your economy bigger just by increasing population. That's not necessarily a good thing. What matters is how much growth you can get per person, or GDP per person, because that's going to be ultimately what determines wages and consumption. How do we measure productivity? Well, there's lots of different ways to do it, but crudely, you could think about dividing output per hour into the kind of inputs, the plant and equipment, the human capital, the materials, energy, and so on. But the key thing, what really matters, is this kind of ugly term, total factor productivity. And that's how much extra output you can get given the amount of inputs you're putting in. So, two firms using the same inputs, the same people, if one firm can get more output from that, then that has higher total factor productivity. And that's the kind of thing that we really want. In fact, TFP accounts for most of the long-term growth we've seen in advanced economies, and actually also accounts for much of the differences in the wealth of nations. But that kind of, so economists say that TFP is so important, it kind of puts the question just one stage back, because the question is, well, then what causes TFP to be higher in some countries and some firms than others? And just to give you some idea about how huge these differences are, so this on the horizontal axis, this is GDP per capita for a whole number of different countries. So we normalize everything to the US, and these numbers represent how less each country is than the US in terms of per capita GDP. So 1/2 means 50% of the GDP per capita of the US. So you can see there's a big variation in this. On the y-axis, on the vertical axis, is total factor productivity, this measure of efficiency. So the first thing you can see is there's huge differences between different countries in the GDP per capita and the total factor productivity. One thing which strikes you is that the firms with the countries with higher total factor productivity are also the ones with higher GDP per capita, which explains about half of the differences across different countries. But also it's staggering how different things are. So Tanzania, for example, is 1/64th of the GDP per capita of the US and 1/32nd of the TFP. And what that means in practical terms is that efficiency is so low in somewhere like Tanzania, it takes a Tanzanian a month to make what an American worker would make in a day using the same kind of equipment. So that's a huge difference. And if somehow we could raise the total factor productivity of countries like Tanzania or Zambia, Lesotho, Uganda or India, that could have a huge impact on the well-being and wealth of these poorer nations, in my opinion. So there's a big prize to be gained from improving TFP. Okay, so that's what productivity is, that's TFP is. What about the UK? How do we compare to other countries in terms of our productivity comparisons? Well, this is well known to many people. If you look at relative productivity, this is just GDP per hour in purchasing power parity terms. If you look across a group of different major countries, the UK is not doing that well. So the UK has about 13% lower productivity in the United States, and is also less productive than Germany and France, a bit more productive than Italy and Canada. So that's a reasonably large difference, and if the UK could improve our standing, we could actually have a big improvement in our welfare. So we could, for example, you could think about this as we could all take Friday afternoons off and go down the pub and still earn the same amount of money. So maybe that's the problem with the UK, actually. Everybody does take Friday afternoon off and go down the pub, and that's why our productivity is a bit lower. What's happened over, that's the kind of snapshot. So that was using data from 2010. Things have actually changed a bit over time. So if you look at how GDP per capita has changed over time, going back to this overall measure of welfare, this is the green line here is the average growth of GDP per capita across a bunch of different countries since 1997. Up to 2010, so including the Great Recession. And what's kind of interesting about this, and this is, given all the doom and gloom about how disastrous things were in the Labour years, you might be surprised to know that the UK actually had a faster rate of growth of GDP per capita than any of the other G6 countries. So since 1997, the UK growth was something like 1.4 percentage points a year, which is higher than Germany, the US, France, Japan, and Italy. So that's actually a pretty good performance, and as I'll show you the reasons for that. But part of that is a reasonably good productivity growth performance, and also a good performance in the labour market. Now you might say, well, what about the fact that demographic trends are different and so on? So the blue line tries to take that into account. Just looks at GDP per adult, the growth of that. But you see that doesn't really change things very much. So the UK still has done actually pretty well since 1997, despite all the doom and gloom. If you look at the trends of that, so again, this is just looking at the kind of trend rate. This shows you the cumulative increase of GDP per capita, and it shows you, of course, what everybody knows. In the Great Recession, there was a huge hit of per capita GDP, falling quite dramatically since the collapse of Lehman's and the financial crisis. The slope of this gives you the growth rates in a particular year that you want to look at, and you can see in 2010. Despite the Great Recession, per capita GDP was still 17% higher than it was in 1997. However, if you look at the slightly longer run, so looking at the Labour period compared to the Conservative period, you see that growth was actually a continuation of a trend which happened before Labour. So under the kind of Thatcher major years, there was also a pretty impressive growth of GDP per capita, and that's kind of continued since 1997. If you compare that with the United States, we often benchmark ourselves against the US. It's kind of interesting because in the Conservative years, we grew at about the same rate as the US, and in the Labour years, we actually grew a bit faster than we did in the US in terms of per capita GDP. If you compare that with some other countries like Germany and France, as I kind of showed you on a couple of graphs ago, the UK kind of outperformed those countries and managed to grow faster since 1997. So that's a kind of, that's a reasonable good performance. If you look at one measure of productivity, GDP per worker, you can see that the UK, that's the blue line, grew in terms of this measure of labour productivity faster than France and Germany, but was a bit slower than the US. So this is the post-1995 period in the US was a so-called productivity miracle, when US productivity almost doubled compared to what it had been in the previous 15 years. And then if you look at workers per capita, this is the employment rate, you can actually see the UK is pretty similar to other European countries. It was an improvement after 1997. And the US actually did very badly. So in terms of the employment rate, the US employment rates actually fell quite a bit. The red line, which is the US actually did quite badly in terms of its employment rates. If you think, so what happened to the UK in terms of its post-1997 performance? It did pretty well in terms of productivity, almost as good as the US per worker, and it did much better than the US in terms of its labour markets. And put those two together, the UK actually managed to catch up with some of the other countries that it was behind. So this is another way. This is GDP per hour, and you can see in this, until the Great Recession, the UK was actually keeping up with the United States. So looking at the macro picture, although the UK is behind, it has lower productivity, there's been some catch-up over time. So there was some movement in the right direction over the last 30 years, which actually reversed the trend of the previous 100 years. So if you look at what happened since 1870, the UK actually declined relatively to those other countries, France, Germany, and the US. Its GDP per capita actually fell behind. But after 1979, it started catching up again, and that catching up period has continued under Labour and the Conservative governments. You might say, okay, wasn't this post-1997 boom all about finance, all this kind of financial bubble? Or there was some of that. So if you split productivity, where does this productivity come from? You can split it out into different sectors. And what this shows you is that in the kind of labour period, about 0.4% of the productivity growth was due to finance. So out of the 2.8 percentage points per year of productivity growth, 0.4% was finance. And that's something. Finance is only about is a smaller proportion of the overall workforce than that. But only 0.4 out of 2.8% is about 14%. So most of the 85% of productivity growth was not due to finance. So when people say that the whole thing which happened in the post-97 period was all a financial bubble, I don't think that's correct. In fact, most of the growth was from other sectors like business services, like distribution, and other kind of factors. So it doesn't seem to me that was all built on complete sand. If you look at the conservative period of 79 to 97, that was about 2 percentage point contribution from finance. So again, that proportion doubled from 0.2 to 0.4, but it wasn't all finance, and this actually already takes out the public sector and the property sector. So it does suggest, to me, looking at these kind of numbers, there was some genuine improvement over the last 15 to 30 years in terms of Britain's productivity position, even though we're still behind. And why was that? Well, we can't go into all the reasons, but one of the reasons why I think that there was some improvement was due to human capital. So if you look at the proportion of UK workers who had a college degree, very appropriate for being in this audience, it almost doubled between 1997 and 2010. So a big increase of human capital, continuing the trend from prior to that, which helps improve productivity. Okay, so that's some of the good news. Remember, the bad news is we still have a lower productivity. So why is there this productivity gap? What causes this productivity gap? Well, there's two reasons. The traditional view that most economists would take was it's all due to technology. It's kind of Britain has a technological gap. We're less innovative than other countries. And yeah, that's partially correct. So the sad truth is, although where we are in universities are actually very strong in the UK, one of our strongest export industries. We produce a lot of great scientific outputs. So 14% of all the top scientific papers in the world come from the UK, second only to the US, even though we have 1% of the world's population. But we're much weaker at commercializing that innovation. So if you look at our research and development, our patenting performance, that's actually a lot worse than other countries. So an example of that would be looking at R&D over GDP ratios. And the UK has had this long decline, which in its R&D intensity between the late 70s and today, it kind of improved a bit from the mid-2000s. But you can see that R&D intensity is lower than it is in France, Germany, the US, Japan, and so on. So that's certainly part of the problem. But I think that, and I'm guilty of this as anybody, we focus almost too much on technology, on these hard technologies. And I think that one of the other causes is actually to do with management. And the reason I think that is that many technologies are available all over the world. So computers and ICT are available at a similar price all over the world. But some countries and some firms seem to use them much more effectively. They get much more productivity out of the same technologies they use. And that suggests to me that's something to do with the management, the way that those technologies are introduced. I know that over the course of the last 7 years or so, with Nick Bloom at Stanford and Raphael Assadon at Harvard Business School, both my former students, we've been trying to actually tackle this issue. And the reason it's been hard to tackle is that trying to measure management, to quantify management, to compare it across countries is really hard. And we've been trying to really get a better way of measuring and quantifying management, but it's not been an easy task. And we made some progress, but it's still an ongoing struggle. So how do we try to do that? Well, we developed this survey tool, which has kind of 3 parts to it, and I'm going to kind of talk about each of them and give you lots of examples. But the basic idea is we've developed a series of kind of questions, a kind of scorecard, if you like, of different management practices which we think are important for raising productivity. We developed this after talking and working with many management consultants, people in industry, going out and looking at different types of practices. And those practices cover things to do with how you manage your people, hiring, firing, promotion and pay, how you set targets, are they joined up or are they too short term, how you monitor what goes on, how you collect data, analyze it, what you do with it. And I'll give you some examples of that. But we start off with this kind of scorecard of about 18 questions which we think are important for raising productivity through management practices. And then we talk to people. So we have a 45-minute to an hour telephone call with manufacturing plant managers, and we try and score them based on these different questions. So you might say, well, isn't that completely impossible? You know, how on earth, you know, don't people give different answers and score them in different ways? Well, the tricks that we try and do to get good responses are several. So one is we have this double-blind technique. So the interviewers who are actually doing the interviews don't know anything about the company's performance. They're completely, you know, ignorant, deliberately ignorant about what's going on in the company. And we target kind of, you know, medium-sized enterprises. So a typical firm will have about 250 employees, and not a firm you'd have heard of. It's not a Microsoft or Walmart or anything like that. And on the other side, it's a kind of double-blind thing. The managers themselves who are being interviewed are not told that they're being scored. They think they're having a friendly chat with MBA students who's doing their summer project. In the meantime, this guy's had, you know, 2 weeks training at Accenture, McKinsey, and the LSE, and, you know, he's rigorously scoring these people in the background. You know, and you may say that isn't this unethical? How on earth do we get to the Human Subjects Committee? And the reason we had to do this is that there's a well-known psychological bias. If you know I'm scoring you, you just give me the answers you think I want to hear. One example of that is, there was a famous study done where they these interviewers went around and asked people who they were going to vote for. Were they going to vote for a right-wing party like the Conservative Party or the Labour Party? And the people doing the interviews asked exactly the same questions, and the only difference was randomly the one group of people who were asking the questions were dressed in a suit, with a tie on and short hair, very, looked like this, very, very serious. And the answers came back overwhelmingly Conservative. And then when they sent somebody out looking scruffy with a kind of denim jacket on and long hair and, and sneakers on, then, the answer came back Labour. So, people say what they think you want to hear. And that's exactly why we try and, have this kind of double-blind technique in order to kind of avoid that. Finally, why does anybody, participate in this interview? Well, we introduce this as a kind of lean manufacturing interview. We don't ask any financial information. We get all that from other sources. We got endorsement from many reputable institutions like the Bank of England and the Reserve Bank of India. Different things work in different countries. So in Germany, we have the Bundesbank, and whenever we interview the managers, they get faxed or emailed a letter from the Bundesbank with the big German eagle crest. And when the German managers see this, they immediately respond very well to that, the voice of authority. In the United States, if you mention, we got endorsement from the Federal Reserve Bank, if you mention that you're from the government, then the phone gets slammed down on you, you get called a communist liberal or something. So we learn pretty quickly in America, it's much better to say, this is a summer study by some MBAs. So, and also we have a lot of MBAs who did this. We've employed over 100 MBAs. This is a kind of demand creation study for MBAs and management, people studying management. And MBAs are very useful, and management is very useful because they tend to be loud, assertive, they've got business experience, they don't like taking no for an answer. So that will actually help us get a very good response rate of something like 61% and seem to be a pretty random response rate. So here's some of the questions that we asked. So one set of questions asks, how is performance tracked? So we're trying to look at how things are measured within the firm. So a low score here, or one is a low score, would be if many measures are not tracked at all, they're unrelated to business objectives, some processes are completely untracked, which are important, to a high score where performance is continuously tracked and communicated, and also both formally and informally to all staff. So a kind of middle score, a 3, would be information's collected, but it's not really communicated to people. A lot of companies collect information, but don't ever feed that back to the employees they work for, and it's very difficult to know, what that's being used for. So continuous improvement, collecting information, analysing data, that's one thing which is very important. Another thing is, this is for the people management part of the questionnaire, is that how are people promoted? So a lot of, a low score here is people are promoted purely on the basis of how long they've been in the company, regardless of their effort and ability. And a high score would be the firms who actually actively try and identify and develop their top performers. So all of these questions are up on the website and our papers. You can even benchmark yourself if you want to go up to our website to do this. And the way we get at this, we don't just ask, are people promoted based on the tenure? We actually have a kind of discussion with them. We kind of say, well, imagine you had somebody in your workplace and they were there for a year. Just talk me through your promotion process. And people talk, and from what they say, we then use that to score them. And those kind of open questions, which is a kind of a case study approach, is much better than the kind of closed tick box yes or no answers that economists typically use. So the methodology is somewhere in between the traditional kind of management case study approach and a more kind of economic kind of, hard data approach. So from that, we've now got, actually this is out of date this time, we've now got over 10,000 interviews across 20 countries. We got a good response rate. The response rate was uncorrelated with performance, so it looked like it was random. And although we focused on manufacturing to begin with, we've now also done this survey technique in schools, in hospitals, in retail firms, in tax collection agencies, and a whole number of different areas. And you have to change the kind of questions, but the core questions, like how do you promote people, are completely common across all these sectors. So, what do these questions look like? So is it all just rubbish, or does it actually, is it correlated with things you might care about? Well, it turns out these management practice questions, so we do lots of things with them. One of them is we put them together to have an overall average management quality or practice score. They turn out to be very highly correlated with things to the performance of firms. So the correlation between the management practice score and labour productivity is very high. There's a high correlation with profitability, the return on capital, and also a high correlation with things like sales growth. Now, this is not a causal relationship. This is just saying there's a correlation. So all that's telling you is there's some information in the questions. It doesn't tell you that there's necessarily a causal impact. And I'm going to come on to how we can actually test that causal impact in a few slides. But it certainly suggests that there's some information in these management scores. Now, the other thing that people say is, well, isn't this all just, wicked Anglo-Saxon management questions, and it might be true in Britain and America, but it's not true in other countries. In every country we've looked at, these kind of average management scores are highly correlated with productivity. So whether it's Britain and the US, or China and Japan, or Germany, France, Sweden and Portugal, or Italy and Greece, you see this positive correlation in every country we looked at. So I don't think they're kind of particularly Anglo-Saxon biased, especially as I'll show you, the UK doesn't actually come out that well from some of these. So here's the average score across countries in terms of management. So you can see there's a kind of a Premier League. So there's the US scores the most highly, and it's consistent with its highest productivity. But there's a kind of Premier League of countries who get very high management quality scores: Japan, Germany, Sweden, and so on. And that's kind of unsurprisingly, these are the kind of strong manufacturing countries of the world. The UK is kind of, it's not doing terribly. We're kind of in the kind of, first division. We're there with kind of, France, Italy, New Zealand, and so on. And then the countries doing very badly are, the developing countries, Brazil, China, and India, which unsurprisingly are the countries with low productivity. We were surprised that Greece did so badly. So we first did this in 2004. We didn't have Greece. 2006, we did Greece. And then we got these numbers back from Greece, and we thought, oh, these are must be too low. Greece is a developed European Union country. Why is its management score so low? And then I just wish I shorted Greek sovereign debt back in 2006, because I wouldn't be here now. I'd be much richer had I really believed the scores. And it was telling us something about some of the problems I think that subsequently were found to be true in Greece. So people focus on these average scores across countries. I've always been much more interested in the differences between firms within countries. So this next graph shows you the variation within every country. So what each of these graphs are is we take every firm that we have, and it's just a histogram of those firms. This tells you what, how many firms there are for different scores. So this, the fact that there's a big point here at 3 tells you, the majority of firms get an average score. Some firms get very bad scores here, and some firms get very good scores here. But what's striking about this is just a huge variation within every country. So those averages across countries disguise massive variation within countries. Some terrible firms. It's not like the US, although it gets the average score, every US firm is great. You can see that there's lots of good firms in the US, but there's also many bad firms in the US. However, and this is the kind of key thing, that if you look at what causes the average differences across countries, then one of the things about the US is it has a relatively much fewer really badly managed firms. So this lower tail of really badly managed firms is much thinner in the US than it is in other countries. And that immediately makes you think that one of the reasons the US is successful at management is the economy is much more aggressive at weeding out very badly managed firms. It's a kind of Darwinian process of killing the very poorly managed firms. And just to blow that up, just to show you that more vividly, you can see that in the US. Here's the kind of absence of a lower tail. Here's the UK, and you can see poor old UK. We have a lot of really crap firms, basically, relative to the US, and that is dragging down our management score. So the fact that one of our best exports is television programs about bad managers, like The Office and Fawlty Towers, may not be a coincidence. We may actually have quite a few of those bad managers around. Okay, so one of the good things actually about doing this, you actually end up talking to a lot of interesting managers. So this was one example of where we had one of our British chat-up lines. The production manager said to one of our Australian interviewers, "Your accent is really cute. I love the way you talk. Do you fancy meeting up near the factory?" I mean, what girl could resist a kind of offer like that? This girl did. So she said, "Sorry, I'm washing my hair every night for the next month," and slammed the phone down. So that was how it works in Britain. India is somewhat different, of course. So in India, and this is a real quote for what happened during our interviews. The production manager asked, "Are you a Brahmin?" Now in India you have different castes, and the Brahmin is the highest caste. And the interviewer, this question has been asked before, "Why do you ask?" And the production manager said, "Are you married?" "No." And the production manager, "Excellent, excellent. My son is looking for a bride. I think you could be perfect. I must contact your parents to discuss this." So you see, immediately the cultural differences are very important between different countries. So we've seen this big variation in management practice. So what kind of causes this difference? And what can we learn about what causes these differences across different firms? Well, one of the strongest things is competition. And you saw that just from looking at the raw data. There's several ways in which competition affects management. So one is just through selection, killing off the badly managed firms. But the other is that even for the firms which don't go out of business, competition kind of incentivizes managers to work harder. And in our data, we find very strong evidence that competition is strongly linked with better management, both through the selection effect and through this kind of effort effect. And one way of seeing that, I mean, we do it in a number of different ways, but if you just correlate the number of competitors that firms are facing with the average management score, then you can see for the firms which seem to be facing a lot more competition, the management scores are much higher. And interestingly enough, that turns out to be true in the public sector as well as in the private sector. So we've been doing a lot of work recently looking at hospitals, and we can show that in even the hospital sector, competition does seem to improve quality. Now, we were kind of expecting the competition thing, but here's something we weren't expecting. So one of the other factors which is very important in understanding the variation of management is family firms. And you might, family firms have this kind of theoretically ambiguous effect. So you might think on the one hand, being owned by a family firm might be a very good thing, because having one family monitoring what's going on instead of lots of dispersed ownership, that might be better at making sure firms are well governed. On the other hand, if your family owns the firm but also puts family members in charge of the firm, this is more likely to have a negative effect on management quality. So there's a smaller pool of people to select the CEO. the person knows they're going to be made the CEO, they may work less hard at school, they may have a negative effect on non-family members. I mean, Warren Buffett puts it this way. He says, you know, if you thought about who you were going to select the Olympic team to represent you in next year in the Olympics in London, would you decide to say, okay, I'm going to choose my entire team as the eldest sons of the people who won the gold medals 21 years ago? I mean, that might be the best selection rule, but in all likelihood, it'd be better to actually look at a wider pool of talents before you select people to represent you in the Olympics. And similarly in business, of all the people who could be the best person to run your firm, could be your eldest son, but you know, likelihood is you might want to consider other people. But the typical thing in family firms is to put the eldest son in charge of running the firm. And if you look at the average management scores, family-owned and family-run firms have the lowest management score. They're even worse managed than kind of government-run firms, and that's already pretty badly managed. If you look at family-owned firms who actually have non-family CEOs, who actually look at a wider talent pool, they tend actually to be much better managed. And you know, I think that's you know, often people compare Britain with Germany, where you know, amongst these medium-sized firms, there's a lot of them in Britain and in Germany, but one of the big differences is that the Mittelstand in Germany, family-owned firms tend to get outside managers put in, and that it seems to be one of the reasons for, I would argue, for their greater success than Britain. So family firms is the second thing. A third thing is multinationals. So one of the other really striking things about the data is that multinationals appear much better managed than domestic firms. So these two bars show you, the grey bar shows you the average management score for the domestic firms, and the black line for the multinational firms. And what you can see is that, you know, even in something like Greece, although the local firms are very badly managed, if you're a multinational firm, a foreign multinational firm, you can actually see to transport your better management practices in the country that you go to. So one of the good ways of spreading management might be openness to foreign multinationals. Another factor in accounting for different managerial practices is skills. So if you correlate the proportion of employees who have a college degree, either non-managers or managers, both of those are positively correlated with better management practices. So management is unsurprising. You might think that the more educated managers are better at managing, but you also see that for non-managers as well. It seems to be easier to have better management quality in a firm which has high human capital. And the final thing we look at is labour market regulation. So there does seem to be, at least in the people management schools, the countries with very heavy labour market regulation appear to have worse people management scores. So there's a kind of weak negative correlation between those two measures. So putting those together, in terms of understanding the UK productivity and the UK management gap, three things seem to be important. The weaker competition in the UK than the US, the greater number of family firms, so CEOs are less likely to be selected on merit, and lower human capital in terms of worse education. And basically those three factors account for almost all of the management gap between the UK and the US. So that tells you a bit about the differences between countries and the differences between management quality. But the question you might still have is, does management really matter? So we've shown you there's a correlation between management and performance and productivity. But is that causal, or is it just the fact that there's other things we haven't measured, or maybe successful firms employ good management consultants and that improves their management? So to try and get at this, Nick Bloom and a team of us have actually been running experiments on plants in Indian textile firms outside Mumbai. And the way we try to do this is we've actually kind of mimicked a clinical trial where we kind of gave some treatment plants some heavy management consultancy intervention, and we compared that with control plants who got very light consultancy intervention, basically just enough to get the data. And then we followed these plants before and after they got this managed these interventions to see whether or not, when you randomized in a kind of group of firms to get better management practices in the way I've described, does their performance really improve? And so we've followed these firms now for about 2 years. And the bottom line is that it does seem to be that these improved management practices in the treatment group led to large and significant improvements in productivity and profitability of something like $200,000 per annum, which is much better than much higher than the amount it cost. And just to give you some idea about the changes in some of these plants. These are these examples of what these plants look like before the intervention took place. These are all taken by Nick, actually. I mean, this picture up here is, you didn't want to get the camera to get too close to those kind of, big buckets of toxic chemicals. So you can see that then many of these plants were very badly organized, very unsafe. If you looked at the way that they were on the things were being produced, instruments were left blocking the hallway, oil was leaking from machines, there wasn't a proper monitoring of what was going on, people weren't being promoted or paid according to their performance. So it was a very disorganized type of setup. And then after the treatment, the kind of things which the intervention tried to do was trying to do things like having the machines and factories well organized. If things went wrong, they were snag tagged. So there was a token left on them saying what had gone around so the things could be fixed up systematically. And this information was then logged into a database, and that information was then used to kind of improve the performance and used to tie people's incentives towards their improvement in the performance of the plants. So if you looked before and after this red line up here is the control plants. And it shows you that if you look at this is a measure of the kind of quality defects. So a lower score here means less defects. The control plants who didn't have any serious treatments, their kind of quality stayed more or less the same, whereas the treatment plants who actually had this intensive dose of management consultancy actually had a much lower, the kind of defect rates fell very dramatically, and this led to this kind of big improvement in profitability and productivity due to the treatment. And because this is randomized, this enables you to say, well, there really does seem to be a causal effect of management in terms of improving performance. Okay, so let me finish with, well, what if anything can we do to improve things if we think that management and productivity is an issue for our country? Well, there's things in the short run. If I had more time, I'd talk more about austerity. And obviously the question really, this is independent of the management stuff, but is a debate over whether or not to accelerate fiscal consolidation in the face of slow growth, or actually to slow it down. The Prime Minister made a speech on this yesterday. And to me, the question is partly whether you believe or not, the output gap, the difference between our current output and our potential output, is very wide, as I believe. I mean, there's a lot of room for demand expansion to improve our output, or whether you believe, as many of the more pessimistic people believe, that there is very little gap between our current output and our potential output, because our productivity rates are permanently lower, and our productivity growth rate has been permanently lower because of the Great Recession. And I've argued in a presentation I did last week, where we tried to look at this productivity performance, to show you some of the data I showed you how I began this talk with, that I'm not convinced that our productivity has fallen as dramatically as people think it has. Because I think that if you look at what happened in the period leading up to the Great Recession, there were genuine improvements in productivity built around investments in human capital, investments in innovation, increases in competition, which I don't think have completely disappeared just because of the recession. So in my view, there is a large output gap, and our low measured productivity at the moment is due to demand deficits. We could, in principle, deal with that through monetary policy. At the moment, I think with interest rates near zero, I support quantitative easing, that's going to be insufficient. So I think we need a plan B of slowing down some of the cuts that we've made to investment. I see no reason why we shouldn't reinstate the school buildings program. I see no reason when interest rates are rock bottom that we shouldn't be investing in building roads and repairing our infrastructure. And I think there's also a good case for things like a temporary reduction in national insurance to encourage the firms to take on more young unemployed workers. But the real question, I mean, whatever you think about the kind of current situation in the short term, is what we can do in the long run to improve our productivity, improve our management. And I would emphasize the following thing. So I think one thing, and this is a lesson for the management work, is kind of getting the external conditions right. I mean, we've got to admit we don't know exactly where new growth is going to come from, but the conditions which are going to be important for generating better management and productivity are going to be things like tougher competition, maintaining high levels of competition, looking at ways in which that's being inhibited by a regulatory and planning regime. But also think about increasing our human capital. And that's been a key reason for improving management and productivity. So I think that's extremely important, as is thinking about the tax system. So at the moment, our tax system gives incentives for family firms. I can't see any reason why we'd want to do those. So getting the conditions right is absolutely critical. But I think we can probably go beyond that. So I think we can actually think about what I call a plan V, beyond a plan B, a kind of V for kind of V-shaped recovery. And we should think about areas where the UK has some comparative advantage, what we're good at, and where we and which are likely to grow very rapidly in the future. So, obviously growth areas are things like universities, like healthcare, like business services. And where do we have comparative advantage? And things like, like where we are now, where we have strong academic, science-based pharmaceuticals, we have strong creative sectors. Those are areas where we should really focus on and think of how we can remove barriers to the growth of those sectors. And things we don't want to do, obviously, are things which are going to inhibit the growth of those sectors. So our kind of crazy immigration policy to try and reduce the amount of net immigration to under 100,000 is going to lead us to actually disincentivize the people we want to come to our universities, the faculty, the foreign students, the other kinds of staff. So I really think that if you thought about this kind of strategy of growth where you focus on the sectors which are most important, what you wouldn't want to do is have an immigration policy which dramatically is going to reduce the ability for those sectors to thrive. So what are the conditions for growth? Competition, I've said, is very important, and I think that's true in the public sector and private sector. I think we need to reform inheritance tax to we encourage family firms through giving them a tax exemption for family business assets. The Murley's review made very good suggestions on stability and simplicity of the tax system to remove the bias towards debt. And I think in terms of human capital, the particular thing where we're weak on is on the lower end of the distribution. So I think the work we need to is on apprenticeships. We should never abolish the educational maintenance allowance, which has discouraged people from going from poor families to going to university. Okay, so I've talked about the university. Let me just say one more word on the university since we're here. University students, according to McKinsey, the market for foreign students is growing about 7% a year. As I said, our kind of UK research and share of overseas students is second only to the US. The US actually lost share of foreign students since 9/11, and the UK has actually held onto its position. But our current policies, as I mentioned, are really disastrous in terms of discouraging overseas students from the UK. So I think that would be an example of where we think about a plan that we want to encourage the growth of universities and not discourage them as we're currently doing. Okay, so in conclusion, I say that I've made an argument with the importance of productivity. Innovation, hard innovation of technology is pretty well studied. I think what's less well studied is management. I think that we need, I hope I've convinced you that management is almost a form of technology in itself, which we need to spread out and use to improve productivity. We need to think in terms of policy about an alternative to our current austerity policies. And in the long run, I think we need to try and improve management innovation via reforms to competition, to tax, to universities and R&D. And let me end up with, again, some quotes that, to show you can learn a lot from talking to people. You might think it's pretty easy to define ownership. In fact, it's not that easy. We always trying to define what ownership is. In Europe, one of our production managers admitted that they were owned by the mafia. And I guess the interview said, well, I think that's in the other category, although I guess I could put you down as an Italian multinational. That's how it got coded. This was a slide I presented this in Milan a month ago. And I had to remove the slide because somebody said, if you put this in, you could be in serious trouble. So this slide got removed. Now, Americans do very well in our management schools, but Americans don't do so well in everything. So geography is one area Americans are not that strong on. So what the interviewer asked, how many production sites do you have abroad? And this manager in the answer in the US said, we have one in Texas. Actually, people say Texas really is a different country in the United States. Now, people reward people in different ways. This is, in America, the the way that you reward people. You know, the employee has a company slogan, his name gets used, he gets a TV, employee of the month, he gets a parking space. In the UK, we do things somewhat differently. So we asked, how would you persuade your top performers to stay? And in the UK, that sex is a great thing. The employer finds a new girlfriend somewhere else. I can't do anything. So that's the way to keep your employees. Thank you very much.